Welcome to the Upper Room. We're in Holbrook, Arizona, here at the train station, the old train station, been here since the 1800s, and something significant happened here after Geronimo was captured and surrendered. His men were put on a train here and taken to Florida. I don't know what happened to him afterwards, but if I had a choice between Florida and Holbrook, I'd probably choose Florida, to be honest with you. We're so glad you've joined us. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was connected with one spike, much like this. It was called the Golden Spike, and it was pounded in there in Utah by Governor Leland Stanford. And when they pounded that golden spike in, it was symbolic that from this point on, the railroad could go from coast to coast, and it changed everything about America. We'll talk more about that, but I gotta get off these tracks, because if you can hear, it's gonna get crazy. So what I was trying to tell you before we were so rudely interrupted by that train is that in 1869 something really significant happened. And it was the moment that the railway was connected from coast to coast. It happened there in Utah. They took that golden spike, the governor did. That golden spike, by the way, today is at Stanford University in their history museum. But that meant something tremendous. This is not a real spiritual question. I'm going to ask you to discuss, what do you think was the relevance of connecting the railroad in 1869 from coast to coast? I want you to talk about that. See if you can find some reasons why that might have been important, that was a big deal. I would love to have heard what you had to say in your groups, but it was profound. It really was. Because for the first time, the West mattered. For the first time, you could travel from east to west in a matter of weeks instead of months and months and months. Travel was less expensive. All kinds of things happened. You're familiar with Amazon? The Amazon of the day was the Montgomery Ward's catalog. And when that railroad got connected, all of a sudden people could order things out of that catalog, and it could go from the East Coast to the West Coast. So many things happened as a result of that. And you talk about the way things progressed from that point on, it's incredible. So the connecting of that railroad was really important. Now, we're in the upper room. Jesus is going to connect some things for us, all right? He's going to say something now that is so profound that it should really connect us, number one, back to covenant. Not to beat that to death, but you'll see how we get connected back to covenant. It connects us to Him, and it also connects us to a godless culture that we live in. And so we're going to see what that looks like and what Jesus has to say. I'm assuming you know who General Michael Flynn is. He was the National Security Advisor in the last administration. And I was reading some things he said the other day, and he made a point I thought was just brilliant. He was talking about the value of the Constitution for our country, the foundation it laid, and yet how simple it was. For example, let me put it in context for you. The Affordable Care Act under President Obama was legislation that had 314,000 words in it. The Constitution, on the other hand, had only 4,500 words in it. He was talking about how the Constitution could be read in 30 minutes. The document that laid down the framework for the freedoms that we have had for all these years until now was only 4,500 words, could be read in 30 minutes. Let me give you something else to compare it to. That COVID relief bill, that $1.9 trillion help that they just passed, that bill is 628 pages. They were required to read it. They didn't want to. And so they sat down to read it out loud, and it was going to take them, they figured out the kind of protracted the number of minutes it would take them. It was going to take them 17 hours to read the bill out loud. I think they finally got a speed reader, and they got it done in about 11 hours. Now compare that to the Constitution. Again, 30 minutes to read the Constitution. what has stood for hundreds of years, has made all the difference in who we are as a people. My point is this: Jesus does even better than the Constitution. He boils down our life with him and what he asks of us into much less than even 30 minutes. The brilliance of Jesus' teaching is that he can boil something so profound down to something so simple that can be read not even in 45 or 30 minutes, but literally in about 10 seconds. Let's read John 13, verse 34 and 35 and see how profound and yet how simple Jesus made what he's asking of us. It reads this way: "So now I'm giving you a new commandment," he said to his disciples. "Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." There it is. I mean, he boils it all down. This isn't the time you're thinking of. Another time he was actually asked about, what's the most important commandment of all? And he did say, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. He makes it even simpler for these guys in the upper room. He says, love each other. He makes it so basic, love each other. And it's so basic. The problem is that we tend to say, okay, got it, let's move on to something else. But what he's saying is so profound that we've got to unpack that. Here's an example. We're sitting here on Michael Perry Field. This is where our oldest son, Ty, played his Little League Baseball those years ago. And we have a lot of memories here, but it's Michael Perry Field. Santa Rita Little League, Michael Perry Field. We, for years, said, I'll meet you at Michael Perry Field. People read the sign that you see above behind me, Michael Perry Field. It's easy to say, yeah, I get it, Michael Perry Field. But who was he? We played on this field, our son played on this field all those years, and I honestly never knew who he was. It wasn't until we decided this is where we wanted to film that we realized Michael Perry was a 12-year-old in 1984. He was at Seacrest Middle School, or junior high at that time, and he went to a chess competition and he was abducted. He and another kid, another friend of his, was abducted, and he was murdered. So out of love for Michael Perry, this field was established. And so everybody says, yeah, I get it. But you don't get it unless you know his story. And you don't even get it if you don't know his parents and what they went through, and his siblings and his friends. Does that make sense? It's so easy for us to write off something that we've heard our whole lives. I've heard it, Jesus. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Love each other. I got it. No, you don't get it, is the point. No, I don't get it. I can't move on from that so quickly. So if I made my point, the Transcontinental Railroad was really important, but it had to be tied together. It had to be connected. People look at Christianity and say, well, that's an interesting faith or religion, but it's just like everything else. No, only if you don't tie it together, only if you don't connect it, only if you don't appreciate the depth of what God did when he brought love to a loveless world. And so today I want to go deep with you and unpack this one concept when Jesus said, love each other as I have loved you, love one another. And then he added a little tagline on that's really significant that we're going to get to. So there's at least 3 connections here that we got to make in order to understand it. So what Jesus does here is pretty amazing. In this brief sentence, these 2 verses, he packs so much into there. He connects us in 3 different ways, and we're going to talk about those 3 different connections. And it's accomplishing so much by saying so little. Have you ever known anybody that can do that? I wish I could do that. You wish I could do that, don't you? Okay. The first connection is back to covenant, of course. Doesn't surprise you. This whole context in the upper room is based on the background of covenant that we struggle with because it's not natural to us, but it was very natural to the disciples. So how does he connect this back to covenant? When he says, a new commandment I have for you, in the minds of the Jewish people, a commandment was always a connection to covenant. Because within the agreement with God, within the mutual understanding of what needed to happen in this relationship, commands were pretty natural. There were 10 basic commands that these guys thought of, 619 commands that would flow out of those 10 commandments. So when he says, I have a new commandment, they instantly thought, you guessed it, covenant. Now, when you think covenant, I know I mentioned it before, but you can't think covenant without thinking about the Hebrew word hesed. It is such a beautiful word, such a powerful word, that we can't find its equivalent in English. There's not one word that can even match it. In fact, it takes many, and I'm going to share a lot of these words with you. One author was talking about this word hesed and the powerful meaning of it, and he basically says you can't over-sentimentalize it. Now, what does he mean by that? He means a self-indulgent, shallow feeling or emotion. It's not a sentimental word, is the point. And we have made love a sentimental word. So when you say, oh, hesed means love, not in our language. They're not the same thing. It reminded me of the story of the wife who took her husband. She was concerned about him. He'd been overworking and just didn't seem healthy. And she took him to the doctor and went with him. And after the doctor checked his vitals and kind of looked him over, he pulled the wife aside and he said, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't like how your husband looks. And she responded without a beat, without saying, I know, doctor, I never have liked how he looks, but he's a good father to the children. No sentimental things going on in that conversation, were there? What is the word hesed, and how important is it to covenant? It's all important. It ties the covenant all together. And let me give you a list of words that are English words that they try to use to encapsulate the word hesed. Here they go. They are the words loving kindness and mercy and compassion and loyalty and goodness and great kindness and favor and loyal love, steadfastness, devotion. See what I'm saying? It takes all those English words and more, 10, 15 words to describe the one word hesed. Now, why is that important? Because that's what Jesus is referring to. And he says, I have a new command. They think covenant. We should think covenant. We don't naturally do that. The agreement between us and God and how our relationship will work. And it's all glued together. It's all bonded together through hesed, through this idea of devotion, steadfastness, loyalty, faithfulness, all those things I just described. Okay, let me give a few examples. You'll find the word hesed all throughout the Old Testament if you're looking for it. Let me give you just a couple examples. Isaiah 54:10. Though the mountains be shaken and the hills be removed, yet my unfailing love, there it is, the word there is hesed, my unfailing love for you will not be shaken. My hesed for you. It is the only way to describe God's love. So when Jesus says, love one another, I have a new command, he's tying covenant together with a thing that glues covenant together. It's a hesed kind of idea. How about Exodus 34:6? And God passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Compassionate, gracious, abounding in love and faithfulness. That's all the one idea of hesed. One more Old Testament passage, again, that's all throughout the Old Testament. Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. I deserve mercy. The word for mercy, hesed. Not sacrifice. The knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. We've talked about that before. How knowing God is what God desires, and we know Him, He knows us, and it's all based on this idea of hesed. The word there is mercy. Finally, a New Testament passage. It's 1 John 4:9. John, who's writing this gospel, John writes these letters, and he says, this is how God showed His love amongst us. He sent His one and only Son into the world that we might live through Him. That love is hesed. Does that make sense? That is so important that we understand that when he says to His disciples, a new command, they think covenant, I have for you, love one another, it all comes together. So in that one short statement of Jesus in the upper room, He connects us to covenant again, in case we would forget that. That's all important. And then He connects us to Himself when He says, as I have loved you. Now that opens up a whole new world, right? So how did Jesus love them? How does he love us? How does he love mankind? Well, we could go on forever about it, but let's boil it down to a few things for sure. One, first of all, he paid attention. He paid attention. He noticed. We've said this before, but Jesus was a noticer. Author John Ortberg puts it this way: one of the greatest miracles of life is that God pays attention to us. I want you to pause and think about that. Have you ever thought for any length of time at all about the fact that God pays attention to you? It's remarkable. I mean, we have a hard enough time paying attention to one another, right? I'm trying to have a conversation with my wife, and there she is with the remote, trying to watch 10 different games at one time. Can't get her to pay attention. God pays attention to us. He doesn't have a remote, with his eyes on Africa and his eyes on India and his eyes elsewhere. He pays attention to us. I mentioned in the last lesson about John chapter 9 and that amazing story when Jesus spits in the dirt and makes mud and puts it on a blind man's eyes. Born blind. He's been blind his whole life. And that story fills the entire chapter 9 of John. And there's so many interesting things that go on in that chapter. First of all, it starts this way. As he was walking along, he, meaning Jesus, saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Later on, after he has been healed, he goes back to his neighbors, and in verse 8 it says, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Is this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed he was. Others said, "No, it only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." They say, "Well, how then were your eyes open?" Okay, there's so much going on there. There is Jesus who notices. He just notices. That guy has been there for a long time, so long that his neighbors, the people you think know him the best, he's become part of the atmosphere. He's been part of the wallpaper. They can't even agree. Is this the same guy? So they don't even notice him. Jesus notices. Once Jesus notices, the disciples then notice that this is a good opportunity. An opportunity to ask a theological question. They're not that concerned about the guy, right? They have a deep theological question that they want to ask. As you know, he goes and shows himself to the priests, to the Jewish leaders, and they are absolutely livid because this took place on the Sabbath. And they demand that he tell them who did this. Well, they have an inkling about who did this, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to use this as an opportunity to turn on Jesus for breaking the Sabbath. Okay, so all of that to say, Jesus pays attention to everyone. Even people that you quit paying attention to a long time ago, like this guy's neighbors. Jesus doesn't see this as an opportunity to use you, but to love you. His disciples see it as an opportunity to ask a deep theological question. The Jewish leaders use it as an opportunity to try to destroy Jesus. Can you see how most of us in this world use people for opportunities? We see what we can get from people, what good we can use them for, but Jesus does not see people that way. The first thing you understand about his love, again, it's not a sentimental, gushy thing. He just flat out pays attention. He just notices. Do you notice? Because he said, "I want you to love as I've loved you." Do you notice people? Do you pay attention to people? I heard a research that said that doctors have found who followed this kind of thing, that our blood pressure actually lowers when we listen to people, and it rises when we're talking. I know a lot of people that I'm sure have high blood pressure because they can't stop talking. The thing is, when I'm talking, chances are I'm not noticing you. We need to spend more time just listening and watching and paying attention. That's one of the very first things we see with Jesus' love, is that he has the ability to pay attention. Something so simple. I want to read to you a little segment from a book called The Whisper Book. And it's a great little story to illustrate what I'm talking about. It says, I grew up knowing I was different, and I hated it. I was born with a cleft palate, and when I started school, my classmates made it clear to me how I looked to others. A little girl with a misshapen lip, crooked nose, lopsided teeth, and garbled speech. When schoolmates asked, what happened to your lip? I'd tell them I'd fallen and cut it on a piece of glass. Somehow it seemed more acceptable to have suffered an accident than to have been born different. I was convinced that no one outside my family could love me. There was, however, this teacher in the second grade whom we all adored, Mrs. Leonard by name. She was short, round, happy, a sparkling lady. Annually we had a hearing test. Mrs. Leonard gave the test to everyone in the class, and finally it was my turn. I knew from past years, as we stood against the door and covered our one ear, that the teacher sitting at her desk would whisper something and we would have to repeat it back. She would say things like, the sky is blue, or do you have new shoes? I waited there for those words that God must have put into her mouth, those 7 words that changed my life. Mrs. Leonard said in her whisper, I wish you were my little girl. That's paying attention. Are you amazed at the miracle that God pays attention to us? We know that God does because Jesus did. Jesus noticed. He noticed a tax collector sitting off on the side of the road that everybody walked by and hoped he would notice them. And he noticed the tax collector sitting up in a tree, and he noticed an old widow putting in half a penny into a treasury. And he noticed when a woman who had been sick with bleeding for years and years and years touched the hem of his garment. He just noticed. That's a great place for us to start if we're going to love as Jesus loved. As I said, there's so many things we could say about the love of Jesus, but I want to show you some unique things that maybe you haven't noticed. The second one is that Jesus lent a hand. When I say he lent a hand, it's not that he helped his neighbors move. Maybe he did, I don't know. What I mean is he very specifically touched people. I want to take you to Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 1. Read this to you, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Verse 1 reads this way, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Okay, obviously we don't know a lot about leprosy in this day and age, in this culture, but it's a very real thing, a dreaded disease. It was incumbent upon the leper to let everybody know that he was unclean. Not just that he was unhealthy, but he was unclean. And that uncleanliness could rub off on other people. So people never touched a leper because you could get leprosy from touching a leper. It was the most dreaded disease because the nerves would die off and they wouldn't even know, they couldn't feel anything. Dr. Brand worked with lepers in India for many, many years. And he talks about the fact that he did a study where he watched to find out why was it that lepers seemed to be losing their fingers and their toes and parts of their body like that. What was going on? And he said everybody thinks that it was just part of leprosy. As they studied lepers and watched them throughout the night, they would have rats literally eat away at their fingers and toes and not budge because they couldn't feel it. Do you begin to understand what a dreaded disease this was? And again, it was incumbent upon the leper to never get within, 6 feet. Further than that, they had to distance themselves, is what they had to do. Long before the government told them they have to distance themselves. But they were told to distance themselves. And for good reason, because people literally could get this by touching them. And especially a rabbi. A leper would never go up to a rabbi because a rabbi knew the law. And a rabbi could humiliate a leper if he ever got close. Do you see what I see here? Jesus is so approachable. You see, most rabbis took pride in the fact that they weren't approachable, that they were too busy, too important, too much better than everybody else. You know people like that? I know pastors like that. I know a lot of celebrities, live that way. A lot of people in our society live that way. I want to get to be so important that you just know that I'm so much better than you, that you would never approach me. Okay? You know better than to approach me. And if you did, you do it, trembling. This guy with leprosy came to Jesus, and watch what he said. He didn't say, "Are you able to cleanse me?" And again, it wasn't heal me, it was cleansing. I am contaminated. I need a cleansing. Are you able to cleanse me? He doesn't ask that. He asks, are you willing? Because never, I guarantee you, in this man's life was there a rabbi who was willing. And of course, Jesus says, I'm willing. It's as though the leper was saying, I know you're able. Jesus says, I am willing, and he touches him. Okay. The reason this kind of love is important to look at is because we now live in a day and age, in a culture where we are being told to isolate from one another. We're told that that's what love is. Jesus is the epitome of love. And yet he touched people. Well, yeah, but he doesn't understand it. We could get a disease. We could get like a flu, right? Something, that could make us sick. No, he understood. He also understood that his Father had his days numbered, as does the Father have our days numbered. We are being told to do something that is the opposite of love in the name of love. Isolate from other people in the name of love. But the one who was love himself touched people, even ill, unclean people. Gary Smalley and John Trent did a study where they watched people who were touched fairly often, had human touch, and others who weren't. And they determined after many years that those who have human touch can expect to live longer, that it actually makes a difference in their lives as far as the length of their life. I guarantee you what's going on in our culture right now where people can't be touched, you can't be near somebody, is not just, it may be worse than the virus itself. Psychologists have seen that married couples who have conversations, they are much more apt to be isolated from each other and divorce if they don't physically touch one another during conversations, or at least be close to one another. You see, they say, watch the science. The science shows us that human beings were created to be touched, to be close to other human beings, and you know what? You just decide for yourself. If you're going to let the culture decide for you what love is, or if you're going to look to Jesus who says, you know what? One of the ways I love is I reached out and touched. So Jesus' pattern was to physically touch people. The Jewish leaders of his day, they believed in isolation. They really did. They believed you stay away from sinners, you stay away from the unhealthy, you stay away from people who have certain occupations, you isolate yourself. That makes you feel more important, not Jesus. If you don't get anything out of today other than this, please take this home with you. The culture will always instruct us to do the opposite of what Jesus did and taught us to do. But Jesus had some very special things about him, the way he noticed people, the way he touched people even who were untouchable, the way he was approachable. And again, we could go on and on with this, but I want to finish with this one, and that is Jesus said some painful things to people. Jesus said some hard things to people. In our culture, we are told by our culture that if you love, you never say anything that might hurt somebody, right? That might be painful for somebody. I've mentioned it before, but you go to the dentist and you pretty much expect pain because it's part of the process of becoming healed. There's a difference between pain and harm. Hopefully your dentist isn't harming you. I know that's the great concern. With Jesus, he said some painful things to people, but he wasn't harming them, was he? Jesus never tries to harm us. Let me have you talk about this a little bit, a little discussion question. Can you think of the things that Jesus said to people that would have been painful to hear? Talk about that for just a second. Oh, good. I hope you had a good discussion. I would have loved to I'd love to hear what you come up with. I'm hoping you had a great discussion. I bet you did, and I'd love to be able to hear what you came up with. I'll throw out three just off the top of my head. number one, when he told Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." That had to be painful to hear, didn't it? How about to the Syrophoenician woman who came asking for a miracle, and he said, "The food I have is not for the dogs." He says that to her. We've talked about the context of that, and probably some underlying in between the lines things that Jesus was doing. But boy, on the surface, doesn't that just feel painful? How about to Martha when she's complaining about Mary, and he says, "Martha, you got to understand, Mary's chosen the better thing. She's outdone you here. She's sitting at my feet. You're doing all that work, but she's outdone you." That had to be painful for her to hear, I would think. When he tells the adulterous woman who was caught, and after he saves her from being stoned to death, but then he looks her in the eye, and she had to be feeling like, wow, I can't believe how much this guy loves me. And he continues to love her by saying, "Now stop sinning. Stop doing what you're doing." Paul, under that same umbrella, would come along years later, and he would love people the same way and tell the church to love people the same way. This sometimes is a painful thing to hear. I don't know what you know about the church in Corinth, but it was in a city of absolute degradation and immorality, unbelievable immorality, where they mixed religion and sexual immorality. And he writes to them in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and he says, "I'm writing to you now that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral." Okay, so he's starting to say, and his point is going to be, you thought I would be talking about those people out there. I'm talking about people in the church. He says, don't associate with people who are sexually immoral, greedy, idolaters, slanderers, drunkards, or swindlers. Don't even eat with such people. How about you? But that list he just gives, that's half the church. I mean, really. You don't know someone who's greedy in the church? Someone who slanders other people? And he says don't associate. Why does he say that? Because otherwise they'll think that this is acceptable behavior for someone who follows Jesus. How painful do you think that was to hear when they read that letter? But the goal was not to harm, the goal was to bring healing. And I just want you to know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to say something to someone they must hear. Say it in love, but say it. Say whatever it needs to be. When someone comes to you, receive it. If they say something you don't want to hear, it's painful, but you know down deep inside it's true. Understand they have done the most loving thing, because in our culture today, our culture again has told us that's not loving. I'm going to say it again until I'm blue in the face. We have got to stop looking to the culture to define love for us, because they have messed us up so bad that we have accepted their brand of love into the church. Therefore, we don't do any of these things. We ignore people, we don't touch people, we don't notice people, we don't say things to people that need to be said because we love them, because they're going off the tracks, so to speak, all right? See how this all connects back to Jesus himself and his love and who he is? Essential that we do this, as he says, love each other as I've loved you. And finally, this is a pretty obvious one, and this is the one we usually start with. I want to end with it, and that is Jesus paid the price. Jesus paid the price. We know that. When he went to the cross, he demonstrated what love is. In fact, later here in the upper room, Jesus will say, and John records it in John 15:12, "This is my commandment, love each other in the same way I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friend." So there in chapter 15, he reminds them what he said back in John chapter 13, and then he says, oh, and by the way, maybe the greatest qualifier of love is that one lays down his life for others. He pays the ultimate price. We know that Jesus did that. Sometimes we say, oh, I would do that. We join Peter. I would lay down my life for you. But sometimes it's not that he wants you to lay down your life as much as he wants you to love exactly as he loved. Anne Lamott tells a story that you may have heard before, but it's worth retelling, of an 8-year-old boy whose younger sister had gotten leukemia, and she was going to have a blood transfusion. And as it so happened, the only one in the family that had her type of blood that would work was her older brother. And so they sat him down and they explained to him that if she could get some of your blood, that would help her maybe regain her health. And he said, they said, but it's up to you. We're not going to force you to do this. And he said, can I think about it overnight? And he went to bed, and the next morning he said, yeah, I want to do that for my younger sister. So they took him to the hospital, and they got him up on the table, and and they began to set up the needle for his arm to draw blood, and everything was quiet for a couple minutes, and he literally said, "When do I start to die now?" You see, he was willing to die for his younger sister, even at the age of 8, to pay the ultimate price so that she could live. Of course, he misunderstood what the real need was and how this all worked. But that's the kind of love that Jesus is talking about, that I would be willing to give up my life for anyone if that's what God had called me to do. Now, the third and final connection out of this very brief 2 verses comes in the last verse there, verse 35, where he says, "Your love for one another will be proof that you are my disciples." So what that is a connection to the dying, corrupt culture. That's what it is. It is a dying and corrupt culture that we live in, and they need proof that we are following Jesus. Now, unfortunately, we would much rather do things that are symbolic, right? Symbolic, like the don'ts, right? I don't go to R-rated movies. I don't, smoke. I don't chew. I don't go with girls who do. I don't dance. I don't play cards. Those are things I don't do. That's proof that I'm following Jesus. Or the things I do. I read out of the King James Version, which if you do, that's fine. I don't care. But to think that that's proof that I'm a disciple, not so much. And I go to church once a week, and I wear the shirt, and I go to the concerts. That's the proof that I wear the napkin on my head. That's the proof that I am a follower of Jesus. Jesus did not say that. The culture is not looking at those things that I just described that have been long-standing traditions of Christians of things to do and not to do to prove. They look at that and go, that means nothing to us. In fact, we think most of that is weird. But Jesus knew that, and he said, now if you really want to prove to them that you're following me, love each other. Love each other. He didn't say, interesting, the other places, yes, love your neighbor means love everybody, but here he says love each other. They're watching how you treat each other is what he's saying. Now, again, this is a really important thing in our culture today. We are looking to the culture to tell us how to love. And they're giving us instructions on how to love that's not love, because they don't know what love is. They have no idea what love is. Jesus is the one who knows what love is. We turn to him and he says, love each other. As you treat each other with such respect and honor and servants' hearts, they will see that. And they'll say, now we haven't seen that anywhere else. Let me give you a couple of passages. 1 John chapter 3, verse 11. For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Verse 13. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love each other. Love is evidence that we have crossed over. Okay? We can claim that we're headed for heaven, but if I don't have love, John says, there's no evidence that I've crossed over from death to life. Now, again, in our culture now, even people in the church, as I mentioned in the last lesson, celebrities in the church, church leaders, are saying that whatever the culture demands of us, we need to do. Okay? A big one right now is the racist thing, right? And they say, well, one popular preacher said, my biggest problem is that I have white skin. Now, that's not your biggest problem. God created you that way. So you're saying that the way God created you is a big problem? No, a big problem is if your heart's hard and you evaluate people by their skin, that's a problem. It's not that you have white skin. Does that make sense? But because that's what the culture is telling us to think, we think, well, that's the loving thing to do, is to say and think and do what they tell us to do. I'm here to tell you again that Jesus defines those who follow him as those who love each other based on his standards, not the cultural standards. Very important. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 in the Message. Don't love the world's ways. Don't love the world's goods. Love of the world squeezes out love of the Father. See that? If I'm gonna love what they're telling me to do and do things, love the way they want me to love,
It'll squeeze out God's love in my life. Practically everything that goes on in the world, wanting your own way, wanting everything for yourself, wanting to appear important, has nothing to do with the Father. It just isolates you from Him. The world and all its wanting is one way out, but whoever does what God wants is set for eternity. What you heard me say is, stop looking to the culture for a definition of love. Get your eyes focused on how God defined love. And you may be asking, well then how do I know the difference? There is a telltale sign, and I want to kind of start to wrap this up now. There's a telltale sign of whether the love I'm being drawn to live out is from the culture, their perspective, or from God. And we find it in 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. If there is an element of fear in what you're doing or what you're being told to do, or the reason for what you're doing, it's not of God. It's that simple. I have an uncle who passed away this last year, and sadly, he bought into the world's, demands that we isolate from one another. And his entire last year of his life, he lived isolated. He had a son and his family who were just 3 doors down. They didn't even spend Thanksgiving with him because they were doing what seemed like love, because the world told them to do it. He died in isolation. Do you really think that is God's will? That is not God's will. I know. This opens up the can of worms of respect all authority, but there comes a point where you got to decide, is it going to be God or is it going to be the world? And the world's instructions to us, for the most part now, and you've got to discern this, whether or not that is coming from fear, and they're instilling fear in us. And if they are, that is not love. Love one another, he said, as I have loved you. There was no fear in that love. And they will know that you have this love, that you are my disciples, by how you love. It cannot, it must not include fear. If you're doing things out of fear and calling it love, you're not understanding God's word. The way Jesus taught us to love, to notice people, to pay attention to people, to touch them, to be willing to do the hard things, to say the hard things. All that is encapsulated in this story, and it's been around a long time. You may have heard of it. Miss Thompson was a 5th grade teacher who enjoyed most everybody in her classroom. One of her kids, by the name of Teddy Stallard, was just hard to enjoy. I mean, his hair was always messed up, his clothes were musty, he hadn't had a shower or bath for weeks usually. When she spoke to him, he would be slouching in his chair and he wouldn't look up at her, and he would just give her a one-word, one-syllable answer, yes or no. And so she kind of got frustrated with Teddy, and so when he turned in his paperwork, there were a lot of opportunities to put X's by things that were wrong. And when she wrote the F at the top of his page, she did it with a flair. It's not that she didn't like him, she just didn't enjoy him like the rest of the kids. And she wasn't afraid to let him know, and most teachers would understand, but she should have known better. You see, teachers have a record of their students' progress and their past. And here's how Teddy's record read. 1st grade, Teddy shows great promise with his work and attitude, but poor home situation. 2nd grade, Teddy is a good boy, but he's too serious for a 2nd grader. His mother is terminally ill. 3rd grade, Teddy is becoming withdrawn and detached. His mother died this year. His father shows no interest. 4th grade, Teddy is a troubled child. He needs help. Christmas came, and all the children, as they traditionally did, brought gifts to the teacher and came up to the front and piled them on her desk, and she was excited to unwrap all of them, and she knew which one was Teddy's gift because it didn't have the colorful ribbon and wrapping that most of the kids had. His gift had been wrapped in a brown paper bag with Scotch tape on it, and she understood that. When it came time to open his present, she tore off the paper and opened the box. Inside was a rhinestone bracelet that had several stones missing, and a bottle of perfume that was mostly used. The kids began to giggle and laugh, but the teacher gave them the clue that that was not appropriate, and they quickly quieted down. She had enough sense to lift up the rhinestone bracelet and wrap it around her wrist, and she took the perfume and sprayed it on her, and the kids all followed her lead by saying ooh and ah. Well, after the class had emptied out, only Teddy was left, and then he came up to her and he said, "Miss Thompson," he said, "you sure smell pretty. You smell like my mom. I haven't had that smell since she died. And the bracelet is hers, and it looks so good on you." After Teddy left, Miss Thompson fell to her knees weeping and asking God to forgive her for taking such a young boy for granted. The next day, the 5th grade class had a new teacher. It was still Miss Thompson, but she was a new person. She had vowed to God that she would see all the kids differently, but especially Teddy Stallard. And she did. And she came alongside Teddy, and she helped him and encouraged him and tutored him. She went the extra mile with him, and he actually began to catch up with the rest of the class. And at the end of the class, it actually surpassed some of the other kids in his abilities and his skills. It wasn't long after that that Teddy moved away, and she didn't hear again from him until years later when she received this note. "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm graduating from high school, and I wanted you to be the first to know. Love, Teddy Stallard." 4 years later, she received another note from Teddy, and it read like this. "Dear Miss Thompson, I want you to be the first to know I'm second in my class. The university has not been easy, but I really liked it. Love, Teddy Stallard." Another 4 years later, another note appeared. "Dear Miss Thompson, as of today, I am Theodore J. Stallard, MD. I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm going to be married the 27th of July, and I would love for you to come, and I would love for you to sit where my mother would have sat. You're the only family I have now. Dad passed away a couple of years ago. Love, Teddy Stallard." Miss Thompson did go to that wedding, and she sat where Teddy's mom would have sat, and she deserved to sit there. You see, when somebody, whether it be a teacher or anyone else, understands how to pay attention and to love people, no matter what their circumstances, they've understood what Jesus meant. Love one another as I have loved you. And the golden spike has been planted, and it all comes together. It's all connected now, isn't it? The kingdom of God is brought together by a love that is so spectacular, so uncommon, so rare, that people in this world will not help but notice. Drive the spike of love, would you?